evening, everybody. My name is Jesse Meyer, and welcome to the Dog of War February 2026 PF topic discussion. It is great to have you all here tonight. We're going to have this should last about an hour and 15 minutes. We're going to have start off by having a discussion of the topic, followed by some Q&A. During this time, we're going to do the presentation. During this, we'll have some time where we'll stop and we'll have a chance for anyone to ask questions, so we don't have to wait until the end. But I do encourage you to write those questions down. Also, you can drop those questions into the chat if you have something that you really need to ask. My partner in crime, Mr. Joe Rankin, the debate coach at Bettendorf High School, will be triaging those and providing answers. Joe, would you like to give a little bit of an introduction about yourself and your team?
No problem. My name is Joe Rankin. I'm the head coach at the Bettendorf High School speech debate program. This is year 21. Good golly. It's year 21. So, I've had experience in Lincoln Douglas debate, public forum debate. Well, after 21 years, you have experience in just about anything known to man. So hopefully, if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to put that in the chat and I will either answer them directly or make sure that Jesse is aware of them when he does have those Q&A times to go through. So thanks for being here, though.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. We're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. So let me go ahead and get all the tech pulled up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so tonight we're here to discuss the February 2026 Public Forum Resolution, the official NSDA sponsored resolution. This is really kind of an important topic for a lot of people. Not only is this a topic for a lot of the really big February into early March TOC tournaments, some of the last tournaments that are going to be on the docket, like Stanford and Harvard and the University of Kentucky's tournaments and Lakeland and a lot of others. But this is also the topic that kind of kicks off the Nat Qual season. This is where a lot of teams will start their national qualifying journeys. I know Iowa's is in mid-February around Valentine's Day weekend. But from here on out, we're basically kind of entering the final stages of the debate season. And so this is really an important topic for a lot of people. As well, this is the topic where a lot of states start their either state tournament qualifying journey or they do their state tournaments. So this is really an important topic, and it is a really interesting topic in terms of like what we're doing. We really haven't. The NSDA has really not addressed topics dealing with, things like sports betting before, and this is something that, as we go into the history, has really become kind of a more modern issue, a more modern problem, if you will. So this is a unique topic for us to discuss. So the resolution is resolved. The Federal Trade Commission should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. The first thing I like to do when we're discussing topics is to peel away all the pomp and circumstance and figure out what really are we debating. And there are two basic levels. First is kind of the rewording. Should the Federal Trade Commission step in to control fast-growing U.S. sports betting industry? So that is kind of the way to explain it. If you were talking to your students, trying to explain to novices, hey, this is really what you're going to be debating. Think of it like this, and then put the resolution around it. At its core value, if you're going to be working with more advanced, more varsity level students, you really want to talk about this being an issue of states' rights and who is best to regulate industry. So, a term we're going to talk about later in the presentation is the concept of federalism. Who is best to regulate? Who is best to manage? And this is actually an issue that has kind of really stepped up its pace in the last couple of years, especially with the rise of more of the state regulations over things like education and healthcare and prisons and judicial restraint. So this is a very timely topic in terms of both for the sports betting as well as the core issue of states' rights and federalism. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to the Dog of War, which is sponsoring this presentation. The Dog of War debate, where we focus on what really matters to you: education, development, responsibility, and growth. We offer a host of resources, all from tournament resources like extemp questions for rounds, impromptu, Congress legislation, and tournament software and management. all the way down to team stuff. So whether you need prep for Congress bills or you need some practice questions for your extempors, whether you have need teaching aids for the classroom, we offer resources for students as well. Maybe a student wants to do a Sunday morning debate class, which we do offer. As well as that, we offer things like private coaching. And as a new addition that we are adding in a couple weeks, we have a free async speech tournament. So if you have any speech students at your schools that are interested in getting 5 rounds of expertly judged speech in, where we do offer trophies, reach out to me. We'll have a chance to talk a little bit about this at the end. But we are offering a free async speech contest where all the videos are submitted ahead of time and judging takes place over the first week in February. With that being said, let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's discussion. So some key terms that we need to know and we need to understand as we delve into this topic. First is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, originally created in 1914 to protect people from scams and unfair business tricks. This at this time is where we actually have a term that is not used as much, but is something that you probably have heard kicked around: snake oil or snake oil salesperson. This is where that term came up. It came out of people hawking and selling cure-alls for disease or products that didn't work or things that were just nonsense. And the FTC was created to regulate the advertising and the distribution and the promotion of these products to protect the consumers who did not have the necessary information to make a fair assessment. The key thing to know when we're discussing the FTC is we need to look at what powers do they really have. The FTC, like a lot of agencies within the government, are just that. They are subsidiaries of congressional or judicial or executive power. They themselves gain power from the branch they're created from. Okay, they are not powerful entities in and of themselves. They have to be granted power by somebody else. So a lot of people treat federal agencies like they can move mountains or they can, change the world. They still have to have some sort of incentive to do so, or they have to have backing to do so. So one thing that we need to look at as we delve into what the FTC can do is, do they have the power to do what you think they can do? One thing to watch out for, teams that are going to be talking about wide sweeping change that the FTC is going to try to mandate. You need to stop and say, like, that really isn't of their purview, or if they try to do it, this would be wholeheartedly unconstitutional. It would be illegal, and it would most certainly held up in struck down in court. So one thing to look at when dealing with the FTC again is the regulatory aspect and what powers do they have. A federal regulatory framework is a broad definition. It's a set of essentially national rules that is implemented by the organization, in this case the FTC, in order to monitor or regulate something. And it's the same across every state. The thing that we need to ask ourselves with this is, do the regulations that would be put in place have the same power as a law, or would they need a law to back that up? I was having a really interesting discussion with a friend of mine who teaches debate in mainland China for a private debate club. And one thing that we got to discussing was, does the FTC have the power to do what we think they want to do or what they think they can do without congressional action? And this gets a lot more unclear after last year's Supreme Court decisions where they overturned the Chevron decision. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But essentially what it said is that the federal agencies no longer have the power to create regulations without congressional approval or judicial mandate. So the question is does the FTC even have that power to begin with? Sports betting is one of the key words. Placing money on bets on games. It's legal in 38 states. It's now legal in 38 states starting in 2018. Key thing to understand with sports betting is that sports is a very broad topic. Sport, and I go back to one of my hobbies that I've been playing for years now. Magic the Gathering at one point was considered a sport. You could watch the Magic World Finals back in the 90s on ESPN. Then it kind of fell out. People saw it as a card game, and now it's back to being an esport, since esports have now become a thing. So really the definition of a sport is broad. You've got things like, what is it? The slap fights that people can do, the power slap competitions. You've even got, again, poker is now being considered a sport. So it is a broad definition. I recommend that you nail down what it's going to be. Just because not only does it prevent you from squirrely cases when people try to say we can regulate X, Y, and Z, it also allows you to say we can regulate, 1, 2, and 3 in terms of, regulating things like games. I've been reading online about some people trying to regulate Roblox through sports betting laws. So it could happen. It could be interesting. Interstate commerce is codified into the U.S. Constitution. Interstate commerce is defined as business crossing state borders, which then gives the federal government power to regulate and make rules. Generally, anything within a state government, usually the federal government, outside of a couple regulatory aspects for safety, most intrastate commerce is intrastate commerce is regulated by the individual states. Interstate, where you cross a border, all of a sudden it becomes a federal issue. So the key thing to remember is that we're regulating sports betting that is national, that is more large scale. So there is a thin fine line followed by a large gray area when you're dealing with certain things like brick and mortar casinos or things that happen in person. So if you go down to the Hard Rock Casino in Las Vegas and you place a bet on the Seahawks to win the NFC, versus betting on DraftKings, your DraftKings app on your phone. Is there a difference? What regulations kick in? What if the Hard Rock Casino then offers an online platform? Where does the line get drawn? Kind of to talk a little bit about the FTC structure. And again, we could spend 2 hours on this. That's not my purpose today. I want to get to the meat and potatoes of the arguments. So FTC was created in 1914. Key things to know about them is, one, they are an independent agency, or they're supposed to be. It's supposed to operate separately from outside of presidential control, outside of any sort of interference. Essentially, the members of the commission, which there are 5 of them, they serve 7-year terms. And it has been kind of an unwritten rule that there's supposed to be no more than 3 from one single party. So you could have 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats. You could have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and the rare independent that sits on the committee. But generally, you are not supposed to have more than 3 members because you don't want a political bias so that one side really takes hold. We're going to see that really does not exist much anymore. We live in a really unique world since in the last 6 to 8 years where political partisanship tends to have infiltrated a lot of areas of our lives. Their job is to protect consumers against fraud, against deception, against identity theft, against predatory practices. They're the ones that when you see these stupid ads for miracle products online, that they're the ones that are supposed to be cracking down on them. They were the ones that or one of the agencies during COVID that cracked down on all these fake cures and these, fake vaccines that were coming out because they were just nonsense. I know for some of you that may spend a lot of time on TikTok, you may be thinking, well, there's lots of nonsense on the TikTok store. What are they doing? They're doing their best. The one thing we're going to talk about is that this agency was normally understaffed and underfunded, but especially in the era of post the Department of Government Efficiency's cleaning and Elon Musk cleaning, that they have really been reduced to a shell. So the thing we're going to talk about is do they really have the power to do anything that they think they want to do? Their last is they want to promote fair competition. They want to promote it so that advertising is truthful and honest, so that exorbitant claims of success really don't start drawing people in without any sort of backing. This is where they kind of regulate the industries that are trying to advocate the claims of we're the best, what proof do you have? Or, this is scientifically backed. They're going to ask what science does actually back it up. Or are you just using buzzwords? Recent controversy, March of 2025, so March of last year, we started seeing some political interference into the FTC. President Trump removed two of the Democratic members of the FTC before their term was up, breaking the tradition of the agency's quest for independence, and then tried to appoint Republican members. A federal judge ruled later that these commissioners should be protected from removal. That the president has the power to appoint, but nowhere does it give him the power to remove or to fire. So one thing so why this matters, it raises concerns about whether the presidents can control independent agencies, and if they can, what kind of interference could be set out. If the FTC can be politically biased, what's to say that major casinos don't lobby the president to appoint casino-friendly members to the board, or maybe members that are friendly towards a certain industry, maybe medicine or payday loans. Right now, the case actually a couple days ago that could have effect on this was the firing of the governors on the Federal Reserve Board. The Supreme Court just heard a case on whether the president has the power to fire that independent agency's members, which will then have broad sweeping impacts on this. But based upon the way the Supreme Court rules, we won't hear the decision until probably national. But it's just something to be thinking about, something to be looking at as you're doing research. So, do we have any questions about the topic so far, or anything that I've talked about?
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, cool. So, kind of just a very brief history of gambling in the U.S. In 1930, gambling first. Let's back up a little further. Gambling has always kind of been a staple of societies in general. Gambling was always a way to break the time. There are letters of mothers writing to elder sons during the Civil War, asking, please watch your younger brother. Don't let him get involved in that debauchery of card games. Warning their brother, to keep the younger brother from gambling. But really, some of the first legal, in gambling in, saloons or parlors, or even some of the first pseudo casinos, existed. There, as it grew in popularity, regulations became a thing. We really see a milestone, though, in 1931 when Las Vegas finally gets legal. Las Vegas, and this kind of built the city of Vegas. Before this, Las Vegas was basically like a watering hole in the middle of the desert. It was basically a stop on the way from the cities in the east all the way to Los Angeles and California and San Francisco. Nevada legalized online gambling, or legalized gambling in general. And all of a sudden, they needed a place to build it, and Las Vegas seemed to be a pretty, popular option. It was away from the major cities, which is what a lot of the moral rights groups within these major cities wanted. They wanted them away from the big cities. So they built it in Las Vegas, and in doing so, Las Vegas became a big city built on gambling. In the about a decade later is when you start seeing mob money flowing in. You start seeing the mobs in the east, the Chicago, Kansas City, and New York mobs saying, "Hey, we want a piece of that." So they not only start using their money to fund it, but they also get money from pension funds. A lot of the old casinos, a lot of the pre-casinos, the casinos that my grandparents went to on their honeymoon, were built by the Teamsters pension funds. So organized crime does start getting involved with this to build the first major casinos. A lot of those casinos have been torn down and rebuilt. They're more corporate funded now, but mob money funded it. If you want a cool movie that talks about it, the movie Casino with Joe Pesci, fantastic movie that talks about the rise of casino gambling with following Lefty Rosenthal. Good movie. 1992, Congress passes the PASPA, which blocks states from allowing sports betting. So it limited sports betting, which limited states from essentially legalizing it. Now, certain states were grandfathered in. Also, this law did not have an effect on tribal casinos. Okay, on Native American reservations that existed, especially in kind of the center part of the country, from the Dakotas down to Texas. A lot of these areas, so either states that were grandfathered in, so Vegas was still allowed to keep a lot of their casino books going. And it provided exemptions for, again, for tribal or reservation casino based casinos on Native American land, because they were exempt as part of their agreement with the government. In 2018, we have the Supreme Court case of Murphy v. The NCAA, where the Supreme Court killed the PASPA, and we're going to talk about that, in the next couple slides. Finally, we get into 2024 with the explosion of digital expansion. Digital online gaming and casino betting had existed prior to this. It actually really got its boom, not necessarily in 2018, but in 2020. Seeing as how a lot of casinos were all casinos in the U.S. were basically shut down because of the pandemic. So, not wanting to miss out on some money, this is when you see the explosion of online gambling. 2024, we really start seeing it take off. We're seeing a lot of, even to the day where ESPN is now sponsored by DraftKings. As of today, 38 states now allow online betting through their mobile apps. And this is really where the crux of the debate topic is going to be resting, because a lot of sports betting is now done through borderless means, where as long as you have a phone and an internet connection, you can log on to gamble. You don't need to go down to, the Isle Casino or the Hard Rock or the Diamond Joe's in order to gamble. So the sports betting markets. So the image up here is what a lot of what you call sports books will look like. So sports books are where you do bet. It's where they exist in casinos. Sometimes you have OTBs, which is off track or off site betting, which can allow it. But if you go into the sports book at a modern casino, this is what you'll see. TVs, windows where you can place bets. Sports betting jumped from physical to digital casinos almost overnight on your phones. Bets can happen through apps, and I'd imagine you all know some of these bets. If you watch any sort of YouTube videos for entertainment, you see them. DraftKings, ESPN bets, pay for play. They permeate everything, which is a problem. Which is actually what this topic is getting at: is how do they advertise? YouTubers get sponsored by these companies. It's really kind of disturbing in a lot of ways on how they market. It even gets disturbing insofar as a decade ago, watching, the college football championship last night with Indiana and Miami, they would talk about, who's projected to win. They would talk about it in a sports aspect. Last night, turning on the game, they were talking about, will they beat the spread? That's not something I usually hear ESPN and analysts doing, but it will happen. Things that you can bet on, and again, we could cover this for hours, but you could cover who will win. When you place bets, you can talk about things like who will win. So that's what we call the money line. So you could say, I just straight up think Indiana will win. I don't care about the score. I don't care about anything else. Indiana's going to win. How much will each team win by? So that's what's called betting the spread. So you can bet on not only who will win, but you can bet on by how much. Or you can bet on a team that says, yeah, I think that team's going to lose, but they're not going to lose by 10 points. They'll lose by 7. So you could place a bet to say, well, I bet that the Seattle Seahawks are going to win by 14 points this weekend. Yeah, and you can make money off of that. You could bet on the score. So you could bet on what will be and it's usually known as the over-under. So last night, the over-under on Indiana-Miami was 48.5 points. So if you bet the over and they scored more than 48.5 points, you would win. If you bet on the under, you would have won if they scored under that, and they scored under that. Just as a kind of a weird note, the over-under is always done in half points, so they don't have ties. You can bet on random aspects of the game, and by random, I mean not tied to the score who wins. So you could bet that Travis Kelce has 2 touchdowns in a game. You could bet on who will win the national title for 2027 in college football. You could bet on will a certain basketball player from the Sacramento Kings have hit 3 free throws. You can bet on pretty much any aspect tied to any individual game, any individual player. You can do things like making parlays, where you can bet on multiple aspects of a game to magnify your choices. So you could bet on, the defense on Seattle's defense to allow no more than 10 points. You could bet on Sam Darnold to throw 3 touchdowns, and you can bet on the over under. And if you win all 3, you'll win more money than if you would bet on each one. One thing to note is that there are a lot of places where you can bet on just really weird things. So you betting on how many times Donald Trump says the word bigly in a speech does not count as sports betting because it is not a sport. Betting on whether Travis Kelce breaks his leg in a game, which there are websites that allow you to bet on that kind of morbid item, is not sports betting. It involves a sports game, but not directly influenced by the score. One of the big problems with this is that because there are so many options and the way they set it up, and again, going back to the first screen, when you see, I believe this is a DraftKings screenshot. When you look at this, it looks like, like any other game that you would play on your phone. And part of the problem with online gaming, especially with online sports betting, is that they have gamified it. A lot of apps you're allowed to add money once you put in your credit card or your bank account. You're allowed to add money with a click of a button. It's like buying online currency or online gems or whatever your game uses online for any Candy Crush or Clash of Clans or whatever I don't know, whatever, Fortnite, whatever games you want to play. And that becomes a problem is that there's a difference between walking into a casino and putting a bet down on Denver this weekend. There's a different feel when you can do it from lying in your bed, playing and, going from playing, Candy Crush to then opening your betting app. It triggers something different in you. There's less inhibition. So people are finding that it's more easier to bet. And that's a problem when gambling is a known addiction and it is a known epidemic. Any questions about anything we've talked about so far? Joe, is there anything that has popped up in the chat?
One question just about like how FanDuel and another major sports betting company donated $500 million to the Trump administration. How would that impact with like fiat in the round? And would that be considered an argument for this particular topic? I did go through and answer it a little bit in my terms, but if you want to address it, that was one that came up.
In terms of fiat, it kind of depends on what you're necessarily talking about. Like in public forum debate, we generally grant the idea of limited fiat. The idea that when you vote pro, something will happen. Because let's face it, with 99.9% of PF resolutions that come out, the pro almost never will happen, even though it's a great idea. Like change will rarely happen in a lot of these areas. Generally, though, just because FanDuel donated $500 million or whatever or 500,000 or whatever the amount was, just because they donated that money doesn't necessarily affect whether or not the resolution will take effect. What it does affect then is one of the arguments that we will talk about in the argument section is whether or not there will be political bias or political partisanship when the FTC makes regulations. So that could then end up being either a corruption argument for offense or B, a defensive argument when it comes down to the ineffectiveness of the regulations that would be put in place. So I don't think it affects whether or not the pro will ever happen because I think fiat does protect that. Essentially, we assume that the FTC would do something if you vote pro, but I think it affects on the efficacy of it. Okay. So just a quick little map. This is a map accurate as of January of this year, so January 1. This is a map of the states that have legalized gambling. Red states have said no. Green states have said yes. Yellow states have said yes, but later in the year 2025. Based on what I looked at when it comes to Kentucky, Maine, and Florida, they will be legalizing gambling at the end of the fiscal year in June. So I did not look at Nebraska, but I would imagine it's close to the same. But yeah, these are all the states that will be legalizing gambling this year. The important thing to recognize, actually, I'm going to save that comment for later because I think it goes better in a different section. But yeah, current states that have legalized gambling, a lot of areas that haven't. We'll touch on. I'm going to cover this very briefly. Big pockets to talk about why states have not yet legalized from what I've been researching. One, Alaska and Hawaii have not yet legalized because they're concerned about addiction. And this is especially true in Alaska where you have 16 hours out of the day in a lot of places where it will be dark in the winter. That addiction, that Alaska is one of the highest states when it comes to addictions like alcoholism, because when you have a state that is 5 to 6 months of the year in darkness, people turn to alternative means to stay active. And one of the reasons why Alaska has not done it is because they're afraid of providing a place for people to go in order to kind of get that light stimulation, that being around people, and that it would lead to bad consequences. Hawaii is basically the same way. The fact that Hawaii is so small and so isolated, there's tourist stuff to do there, but I have friends that have lived in Hawaii for a couple years. They say once you get used to the fact that you're near a beach, it just becomes a tourist thing. You have the Deep South, so the Mississippi, the Georgia, South Carolina region, which is mainly done because of religious concerns with online betting. They have erred towards this in terms of banning it or keeping it banned because of the concerns of immorality. And then you have states kind of in the central to western part of the country. Some of it is a little religiously based. A lot of it is because those areas also have very strong brick and mortar casinos, very strong brick and mortar gaming. And so they're afraid of if they were to open it up to online gaming, that it would allow that then they would be. Well, let me back up. Nevada's legalized online gaming because their casinos are large enough they can run these online platforms, so they can make money from any state that's legalized it. The states with strong brick and mortar casinos don't necessarily want to legalize it because they know their brick and mortars can't expand the way large casinos can. And once you open it up and you turn green, then all of a sudden those apps can be used in your state, and it draws people away from brick and mortar. Why would you want to go out on a cold or rainy day to a casino when you can open up an app? And this is going to be real true later this week when the southern states get hit by an ice storm. You're not going to go down to a casino to gamble. You're going to pop on DraftKings. So just something this is kind of an interesting map, and this will play an impact in some of the debates that we get into later. So Murphy v. the NCAA, this was the game changer. The court ruled that Congress can't force states to keep sports betting illegal. This violates the Constitution. It violated the Commerce Clause because within a state, you are allowed to regulate whatever you want. With interstate commerce with respects, and basically it violated the concept of states' rights and federalism because it treated the states like puppets. It treated the states as though they were it treated the states as though they weren't sovereign entities. This decision gave power back to the states, but it also created 38 different sets of rules, because if you were to look at the 38 states that have gaming and then the 4 more that will be added, that every one is a little bit different. For instance, I have a friend. He is a assistant debate coach in the state of Iowa. Mr. Rankin actually knows the person I'm referring to. Based on the nod that he gave, I think he knows who I'm talking about. He works on one side of the river in Illinois, and he lives on the other in Iowa. If he places a bet in Illinois and he wins, he has to go back into Illinois to claim that bet. He has to cross the very long and scary bridge to get back into Illinois. So there are 38 different sets of regulations. The precedents that it created the concept of original power. This basically said that Congress cannot force states to enforce federal bans through their own laws. I.e., if Congress wants something done, it should do it its own darn self. Congress needs to be able to act on this, so Congress needs to take action to create limits, or Congress through one of their subsidiary entities. Congress it set the Commerce Clause limits, so it said federal power over interstate commerce can't mean direct control over state decisions. Congress can't force states to do things. This has implications in some other areas. Some of us that are, and here's the thing, this is not even affecting me, but there are, for those of us that are a little bit more seasoned in terms of age in this discussion, may remember the day and age where drinking age was 18. and the federal government started using the Department of Transportation, Highways Department, and the threat of cutting off federal highway funds to force states to change the drinking age to 21. South Dakota was the last state to cave, but up until I think the late 80s, the drinking age, or mid 80s, late 80s, I believe, the drinking age was 18 in some states. So if Congress wants something done, it needs to do something, and you can't force states to do it. So this decision could have broader implications throughout. It also created a structured precedent. So court prioritized constitutional design over industry preferences. So in this case, it prefaced the idea that even though there might be a necessity, the necessity falls to the states if it's not explicitly granted to the government. Which leads us into the discussion of the concept of federalism. So this, for those of us that have taken AP government, this will be old news to you all. Federalism is the idea of power sharing. Our Constitution created essentially a multi-layered governmental system between the federal and state governments. This idea was that it created essentially three levels. Two levels are, the big ones we focus on, but technically three. Power sharing, so three levels all work together. The federal, state, and local governments all have different roles. Each one has its own. Has its own regulations, kind of like positions on a sports team. If you are the punter, you deal with what you need to do. You don't necessarily worry about what the quarterback is doing, and the quarterback doesn't worry necessarily with what the defensive line is doing. Okay, each one has their own special roles. Each one works in a balanced system. It prevents one level of government from becoming too powerful. And granted, we have seen a world where this has started to change, and we started seeing seen a fight between what level of government is powerful. We have started seeing like this weird power shift where it seems that certain areas the federal government's claiming control and certain the states are claiming control. If you've taken AP Gov, or if you haven't, you may hear this analogy at some point. It is known as the layered cake, layered versus marbled cake distinction. So in this regard, those who are strict federalists or federalism believers believe in the layered cake model, where each layer is separated by delicious frosting and not one level, and no levels mix. So you would have things like local government controlling things like parks and trash collection and libraries, state governments controlling schools, highways, and driver's licenses, while the federal government controls military, currency, national laws that pertain to national issues. If you are a marbled cake philosophy, you just dump both batters into the pan and you drag a fork through it in order to mix it. The marbled layer cake version of federalism believes that, yes, each level has its diligence, but they do have the ability to share power. For instance, parks generally are managed by the local government, but then you have things like national parks, which exist. You have state parks, which may receive federal money. You even have these local governments helping to manage these state parks. Where state governments, you have control over highways, but yet they receive highway funding from the government. You have the federal government helping to refurbish and replenish roads. You have interstate highway systems. You've got driver's licenses. You've got the states issue them, but for a lot of us, and I know Mr. Rankin had the joys of going through getting his real ID and digging out the birth certificate and everything. You have certain requirements by the feds. Schools, you have generally the states have always had control of them, but the federal governments can provide frameworks for standards and curriculum design. And the federal government, my favorite line from the West Wing is, I don't remember Florida winning World War II. The federal government controls the military, but the states provide recruiting. The states provide National Guard as a supplement. So the question then becomes, when you're dealing with this topic, is who does have the power? Who is best suited to do this? We tend to err more, at least in the last, at least throughout most of history, we tend to err more on the marbled cake version of federalism, that we share power. And so the question that becomes is, who is best to regulate gambling? Are we better with 38 states interpreting it and having that state autonomy? Or are we better having one national set? We started seeing a little bit of change in this area when it comes to things like legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana is one of the issues, since marijuana is still federally recognized as an illegal drug, but yet it is recognized by these states as decriminalized in a lot of areas. Or we also have like cannabis oil or products like that. Any questions so far before we talk a little bit more about regulation? Okay. So today we live in a regulatory patchwork of just stuff. So things like consumer protections differ state to state. Warnings about gambling, how they can advertise, even down to the betting limits, all differ. In Iowa, you can only add $1,000 to an online gambling account per day. In sports books, if you were to go physically in person, they have in-person betting. Well, if you're gambling online, things differ. If you cross the border into Minnesota, you have different ages. I know this is true, that for some schools going from Iowa to Minnesota, you have a lot of 18-year-olds who will when they stop at gas stations for food, they'll go and buy a scratch-off ticket because they're legal at age 18 in Minnesota, but in Iowa it's 21. These are varied. So based on your state, these things like betting limits and ads and age limits differ. And so not only does it create regulatory confusion, but it creates essentially a safety issue. What's to stop an 18-year-old from going into, Minnesota for a weekend and gambling, their college savings away on, red at the roulette table? Licensing standards differ from state to state. So the requirements, the fees, background checks for people to work there, the standards, this is what we call a race to the bottom, where in order to make things easier to incite business, regulations become more lax. So eventually you become essentially the lowest price, which in terms of regulation, which is not necessarily the best thing. Advertising rules, every state's a little different again. In some states, they ban it from social media. In some states, it can be allowed on social media. In some states, it can be shown on videos that are friendly for kids on YouTube. In some states, it can't. And this is a problem, again, when you go down to the fact that it looks like a game. Okay, I did a poll of some students I'm working with out of the Northeast, New York and Connecticut, getting ready for Harvard. And these middle schoolers have friends that use these online bet platforms. And that their parents basically set a limit for them. I think, I'm not going to judge parenting, but I think that's really risky. But the fact that it happens, I know for a fact, I have friends in Iowa that coach that say, yeah, they have 16 and 17-year-olds that use a VPN to get access to online gaming sites. Or even worse, they got their parents to get it for them. And they just hook it up to their debit card. Okay. We are essentially making this into a game like you would see on an app store, because it is. And, advertising, again, can be one of the things that targets kids. I mean, a lot, again, for the adults in this chat or in this Zoom, we remember the 90s when you had smoking cigarette mascots like Joe Camel, and you had advertisements that were pretty much darn near directed towards kids. Same basic problem that we have today. And finally, taxation. In terms of how states tax gambling, both the casinos and the individuals. We have the economic and market impacts on this. Compliance costs. Big companies, big casinos with money always have the advantage because they're able to pay the fees. They're able to expand, and they have more growth potential than some small casino just across the border in Minnesota. Tax treatment effects. Federal oversight could affect if there's federal oversight, it can affect how states collect taxes, what rates they do. So you can start seeing a little bit of backlash. You could see investment and competition. Regulatory clarity increases investment, which may burden smaller startups. Likewise, you may see that if the government regulates it, you may see people saying, well, if the government's regulating it, it basically is like them endorsing it. It must be safe. Finally, we have economic redistribution. Federal rules reshape employment, revenue sharing, and market access. So you could see that, a lot of states, when they legalize gambling, they put a lot of this money, or at least they say they do when they put it up to the voters, that they're going to put it into education or public works. I remember back in the 90s when they legalized, 80s or 90s, I believe. Mr. Stevens, if you could drop in the chat, because I know that you, being a devout follower of the state legislature in Iowa, would probably know this, but it was either the late 80s or the 90s when Governor Branstad signed the bill to legalize gambling in Iowa. I distinctly remember that the sales pitch was that the money would go towards our schools. They try to sell it as a good for the public. States rarely ever fulfill truly on their promises. I mean, in Iowa, I'm sure some money from gambling is going to the schools, but yet then they cut school funding. That's another political talk. We'll move on. Some consumer and social impacts. Regulating could reduce harms. So universal disclosure, betting limits, self-exclusion, having a standard, it allowed the government to create a true floor so that it's not a race to the bottom. You're truly protecting the vulnerable. Data collection, the government could monitor and collect data, because when you go into a casino, the first thing they offer you, and a lot of people get it, is a Players Club card for that casino. Your data's on that. It tracks your betting and it tracks your personal info. You all know that when you download an app like any of the online gambling apps, it's just like any other game. That when you download it, you are basically giving them access to your phone and your personal life. And finally, the one I talked about just earlier is that it normalizes the risk. So that a lot of people would say, well, if the government endorses it, it must be safe, not realizing the government endorses a lot of crap. The government regulates a lot of crap. They don't do it because they realize that it's okay. They do it because they realize it's not okay, and if they don't do it, no one else will. So people could say, well, if the government says it's okay, I'm going to do it, and the government's in the back trying to say, we didn't say it's okay. We're trying to protect you from harm. So these are the implications that you could see. The federal tensions. Murphy emphasized states' autonomy, and any FTC framework would definitely reassert federal control, and that could cause some legal disputes. It could cause some political impacts. I know there are some students that I'm working with out of the coalition in the Northeast that I'm working with, that some of them are looking at political scenarios, that the government interferes, this causes a backlash. It really hypes up the right wing again, the GOP, and they win the election in the fall, and then they read impacts off of that, either good or bad. It could cause some federalism impacts. You also have, what is the harm of federalism, both international modeling as well as balance of power, leading to, I'm sure someone will tie it to nuclear war. Agency capacity, we talked about this at the beginning, is that the FTC has been gutted in recent days. So the question is would they be able to monitor all of this, especially in a digital marketplace? And the second is that would they drop the ball on regulating other industries that also need attention? Finally, political contentions, political infighting. Again, this is the politics scenarios. So before we talk about major arguments and framework, does anyone have any questions about the implications or impacts?
We did have a couple in here. Greg was wondering your thoughts on the big, beautiful bill, how it changed taxes on gambling, how they have to report 100% of their winnings, but can deduct only 90% of their losses. Will that kind of argument matter on this topic? Or do you think that's getting into the weeds, that kind of deal? I don't. Here's the thing, and this is just me kind of, this is my initial hot take on this, Greg, is that I don't think it will, because I think either a lot of the people that do gamble are very on the lenient, are like on the smaller end of, either on one of two ends. Either you're a small end gamer who puts in maybe, like for instance, I'm just going to be upfront. I have an account with ESPN. I put $50 in at the start of every college football season, and as of last night, I withdrew my profits, and I basically treat it kind of like an entertainment industry. So whether my winnings or losses are not necessarily limited. My losses are limited to 50. My winnings are limited to
whatever I pull in. So I'm not, so whether or not I deduct 90% of my $50 losses if I did lose money, I did not, by the way, doesn't really matter. On the other end of the spectrum, you also have like the people that don't care because sadly they're addicted. And again, some of the adults will know the movie Vegas Vacation with Chevy Chase, the National Lampoon series, where Clark's at the ATM just watching the hundreds fall into his hands. Clark, if he told that he could only deduct 90%, he probably wouldn't care. He was addicted at the time. So I generally don't think that that's going to affect anyone in any major way.
Okay.
But that's just my initial hot take. Yep. Joe, any other questions?
Yeah, I think address this as well, but Hannah was wondering, one sec here. Although FTC regulation involves all of these things, since gambling betting is so widespread, if someone were to place a bet from one state where it's illegal, would it make it more of an FTC thing, or would that be dealing with someone else? And I just said, like, I think that just depends on how it's argued. I said that the AF could argue that the only way to deal is by making one set criteria across all the states. That's why the 38 states, 38 different systems can be abused. Whereas the other side would say that's a state rights issue, or, regulation won't resolve because they'll still do bad things.
Yeah, I think that you're right on that, Joe. I also think that, like, again, talking with my friends in other states, I know friends in Texas that use VPNs to get on the online apps. So I think that you're correct on that.
And one other question that popped up here was, how different would new regulation be from PASPA, which is the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992?
Yep.
And if you wanted to address that.
So it would differ because with this is where we get back to the big issue about, does the FTC's regulations have the same power effect as law? Is that laws can be very specific and laws can have enforcement. The FTC, and one of the key things to know about them is that they're not like, they can't say, with betting, they can't necessarily say, let me put it this way, they can control things that are advertised. So they would make it that a game has a clear, when they set odds on a bet, that they're clear and publicly stated. They would make it so that when you advertise, you have to put a notice about gambling being an addictive activity. They necessarily wouldn't be able to control, like, there is a dispute over whether the FTC would be able to control things like bet limits, or whether be able to control things like age access, because those haven't necessarily been FTC issues. And this is probably because what the FTC regulates has never really been, this is a whole new world. So I think that there is a lot to be discussed with the PSAPA, or I believe, or that long acronym. I think that at the end of the day, the main goal of the PSAPA was that it wanted to provide more of a strict barrier than what the FTC, I think, that they have the legal power to do. That is just my hot take, looking at, like, having read a little bit the Supreme Court decision, having read the FTC's powers and regulations, as well as having read a little bit about the law. I think that laws have more of the power to ban and regulate more than the FTC could.
Yeah, and just one more here before we move on, and that was like, sports betting ads right now are they're saying protected by the First Amendment, and also don't target children because it's illegal for underage individuals to gamble, and yet people who are 17, like they are, still receive ads for alcohol. So I had just put in there, like, it's all about specificity, about how regulation doesn't necessarily mean prohibition, and but there's definitely an argument around there. The negative could say, hey, you can't actually cause any change, where the affirmative will say, hey, this will further regulate, restrain, control, just like the 80s and cigarette ads and those kind of things.
Yeah, and that's really good. And I'm going to add on to that, Joe. So talking with some of my friends who deal with free speech con law, and that, because, well, they're lawyers, that you're right, that the government the government saying the government would never say you can't run ads for gambling, because that would be a violation. However, free speech law and Supreme Court decisions allow the government to protect specific groups or classes of people. So you could say that, ads can't be targeted towards certain groups. For instance, you could say, like, listen, if somebody does have a gambling addiction because like their data says that you shouldn't be able to target them, because they do. Yes, kids under the age of 21 get, liquor ads all the time, but you could say that gambling ads can't be targeted towards them, because right now in some states that's not necessarily banned. So you can put restrictions on it. You just can't ban it. And I think that that's 100% true. So it's the ability to restrict and corral rather than actually straight outright banning. Okay, great questions. Now, major arguments, I think one is federalism. And federalism, it can be run on pro or con, and if it was run on the pro, you'd want to argue more on that this is a federal right. The con, it's, states' rights matter. On the pro, you want to argue that consumer fraud is a national issue, that gambling is a national issue, that what is happening, that the problem that the 38 states are inefficient. So it is a federal issue, and that national problems need national answers. And I'm borrowing that straight from Jed Bartlett from The West Wing. I think that is very true. And I think that's honestly some of the impacts that you're going to want to read off of that. You could talk both about like the power of like federal rights, states' rights, and reclaiming those. If you wanted to go big stick, you could go more like federalism. If we don't maintain this, it leads to the collapse of government. Or modeling, other countries want to model the U.S. I know that. Yeah, we are walking into times where the U.S. is not taken as seriously because of actions that our government and maybe our president might have taken, but it is still a thing. We still do have some influence. So if you want to go big stick, you could go with those. If you want to go the biggest stick, I'm sure somebody is going to tie that to nuclear war, because darn it, when I was doing policy in college, we did. Minimizing the impacts of gambling, and this is the thing. You're never going to get, the government regulates alcohol. We regulate guns. We regulate drugs. We regulate all sorts of industries that are seen as harmful, but yet the problem still exists. So the idea is that we're not going to get rid of them. And if you try to argue on the pro that you're getting rid of the harms of gambling, you are straight lying through your teeth. But you can minimize it. You can restrict it. You can talk about, you can reduce it so that the most vulnerable groups aren't being exploited. You can reduce it so that maybe people can't get, people have information. You can regulate it so that at least you're being fair and honest, that when people, advertise gambling apps, they don't show, they have to also talk about some of the harms as well, rather than just, the everyone winning piles of cash. So again, you can't get rid of the harms, but you can minimize them. And again, when gambling is such a horrible thing, in terms of the highs can be high, but the lows are exceptionally low. You could any sort of minimization can yield, any sort of minimization can yield huge impacts. You have the protection of state revenue and brick and mortar casinos. So again, you could essentially brings this back to gambling within a brick and mortar casino. It expanded to crowds, but to our local casinos. One of the arguments is that a lot of these casinos are run, and I've been seeing some people talking about this, that a lot of casinos are run by Native American tribes, and a lot of these tribes or reservation lands profit from this, and this is where they get a lot of revenue in order to provide for community betterment. That's one thing that you could take a look at. Protection of children. We talked about this in depth earlier in the video. But we have a lot that talks about, making it less gamified. FTC, one thing they could do, and again, I hate to go backwards, but you can make an app that basically looks like a game, and you could make it look honestly required to be a little bit more complicated, required to be a little bit less like a game, just to deter people, because when it looks honestly like some of the other games you will play, it really makes it hard. And again, this is where, if we have laws to regulate adult content, alcohol, guns, drugs from kids, why are we not doing it for things like gambling, where, with any sort of addicted activity, we have proof, we have evidence to show that when you start earlier, you are more likely to have harms and more likely to suffer the consequences. Finally, we have curb infrastructure influence, regulating international. One of the things is that would allow for regulation of international casinos, so people offshoring. and you can control where the money goes. There is some really cool arguments to be said that some casinos are some of the bigger casinos have investments or are straight up run overseas. And that there has been evidence that some of these casinos are being run by some of the more unsavory elements. Let's go back to mob crime. Let's go back to rogue nations. Let's go back to terror groups. That then the profits then go to fund some of their activities. One of the arguments that I was thinking about with some of the middle schoolers that I've been working with in the Northeast Coalition deal with that. By regulating this, it would allow maybe to curb some human trafficking issues, and we're finding research on it. So there are some cool things that you could go and to talk about with this. In the brief that you will be getting tomorrow via the email that I send out afterwards, I actually have 5 different arguments. I wrote the packet when the topic came out, and then as I got working more with it, I found these 5. So there will be 10 arguments total getting out of this presentation and packet. On the con side, we have things like states' rights being paramount. Online the argument is that states have the right to regulate what goes on with their own borders, and that online gaming, and this is an interesting spin on it, is when it deals with online, states have the rights to legalize if they want. So, Illinois could say, no, we don't want online gambling. We're not going to let it happen. Are there ways around it? Yes. But again, if people want to get around something, they will. I mean, VPNs are a thing. Government control, corruption, the FTC has become partisan. This goes back to if you donate $500,000 or $5 million or whatever to a presidential, campaign or a government, could you then have sway? Hell yes, you're going to have sway. And that sway could then cause these, especially if it turns out that the president can fire these commissioners, which will be decided later this year, then all of a sudden it allows for a lot of cherry picking in terms of regulation. And then if it becomes partisan, does that show government corruption? Can you get an impact off of that? If it's corrupt, then do we lose rule of law? FTC collapse. The FTC monitors a lot of different things. And if we require the government to do this, would this collapse the FTC, causing other harms to then overflow in other areas? One of the big ones is the FTC is fighting both phone scams as well as medical advertising, in terms of being honest. So they've got a lot on their plate. State budgets, again, states have become to rely on the money they get from this, and especially in a world where we're seeing states being constrained by taxes, being constrained by other expenditures, even having their federal budgets cut. We're winding up into an area where these states may need that money to fund programs, especially one of the big ones, and one of the big arguments that is out there is Medicaid or Medicare funding and food stamp money, since the government is pulling back and we're putting more pressure on states to fund the gap. Gambling, keeping gambling in the light. Regulations can push gambling into unsafe venues. It can push it into, the back rooms casinos. It can push it into, going out onto the street and talking to a private bookie who will then take your money and, I'm going back kind of the mob, if you don't pay up, we'll break your legs kind of thing. This leads into the rise of organized crime. It leads into personal injury safety. Finally, I'm just going to give kind of my brief kind of coverage on framework. So when you're choosing framework, a couple important things to know is to, one, filter your evidence. Your framework needs to be matched to the impact type. Frameworks are not, and I find frameworks, people generally choose frameworks like they don't choose it strategically. People throw a framework on because either they know it's worked in the past, or they don't really think about where their case wants to go. They also don't think about, things like what is truly in their mind. What do they want to regulate? Like, what do they want to go? So filter your evidence. If your evidence or if your case, when you're done writing, is primarily based upon money, well, economic stability. If it's about addiction, you've got human welfare. It's about legality, constitutional adherence. Don't try to force something in. Don't try to force an argument type in if it doesn't work. If you want to be in economics and you really don't have a knowledge base for it, or you don't like the arguments, don't try to force it, because you will win. It's kind of like choosing your wand in Harry Potter. You're always going to have better luck with an arguments that rather than an argument you try to force in with someone else's wand. Preempt opposition. I like to do this when I try to choose frameworks that neutralize your opponent's best arg. So if you choose a moral framework, if you that really sidesteps revenue debates, because at the end of the day, yeah, we might be making money, but at the other hand, it's not. If it's immoral, it leads to the fruit of the poison tree, or the poisonous fruit of the tree. So you choose framework strategically and offensively. And finally, know your judges. I see too many debaters lose rounds because they try to do this fancy, well-crafted, and honestly, it is beautiful framework. It's wonderful. It's amazing. But with lay judges, you're probably not going to win with that. So lay judges, more simple, value-based framework, something that they understand, that they can know. And again, not saying lay judges are dumb, but you need to understand they don't have the debate knowledge that you have going into this every day. More tech judges, you can be more precise, you can be more strategic, you can be more targeted. So identify what's at stake, identify who is identified, who are you focusing in on, what groups of people and or areas are you focusing in on. Match your evidence to the philosophy. So try to choose what amplifies your framework and test for vulnerabilities. Some frameworks that I think, of course, you have the standard driver off the tee box is the cost benefit analysis. Basically saying is that, we have to weigh societal benefits. UTIL is probably a way of looking at this. It's kind of weighing the cost is straight up like what, going back to the good old impact weighing mechanisms. Consumer protection and public health probably is best for the pro. You probably want to look at like it's the FTC's duty to shield vulnerable populations from predatory practices and protect people. That is the job of the federal government, is to protect our citizens. Federal state sovereignty is probably a good one on con, but honestly, you could do it on pro as well. So post-Murphy, states possess regulatory capacities for localized gambling issues. And you would want to argue that states are best for the job, that states know their populations the best. And, one of the ways to sidestep the online gaming has become big is to say that maybe that's something that the states would need to consider with this. The states would, in part of this, the states would overturn it, or the states would consider that next. Market stability and integrity, this is a pro argument. Uniform federal standards prevent match fixing. Big thing that came out, we had the NBA point rigging scandal back in November, December, and now we have the NCAA points shaving scandal. Those are two good things to look up. You have back in the day the mob fixing fights. You have the mob fixing games. You have organized crime fixing games. You have players fixing games in order to pay off their own debts. So federal regulations could monitor and have a crackdown. That's one area the FTC can do in order to make sure that loopholes don't exist and that people are truly protected and that games are fair. You have the patchwork inefficiency framework. So you would have something like this, is that you would want to argue it would be a framework on efficiency and efficacy. 50 states, if all 50 states did have sports gambling, it would be a hodgepodge of different regulations. Offshore operators would have different regulations and inconsistencies. Digital commerce would be wrecked. So at the end of the day, we need efficiency in government. We need efficiency in states. Essentially, this goes back to the whole idea of, that the government has strict layers of what they have to regulate. Finally, a deontological approach, which is a rights-based framework. If I was doing an LD lecture, I would say deontology is a blanket term to include lots of moral frameworks like divine command law. But essentially, if you say something deontological, you want to say it's a moral issue. You would want to go back to some of the issues with states not wanting to legalize it in the first place, especially some of the southern states, arguing that there is a moral imperative and your impacts would want to be based on morals. Okay, it's the government, it's the government's job, to not necessarily, promote one system of morality, but to promote the concept of a national unified concept of what is right and what is wrong. And then you would want to argue what is right or what is wrong in terms of the pro positions. So to kind of conclude, and thank you all for sticking with me. I know we've went a little over time, so thank you with this. So question, should the FTC regulate sports betting to protect consumers in a digital marketplace, which is a new market? Or would federal oversight undermine state autonomy, increase politicization, and accelerate gambling growth faster than safeguards can respond? Key things to look out for. One, the pros should not just rely on having solid harms. They need to show how federal regulations will solve or mitigate the problem. Note that by solving, you can solve, I mean that in terms of some issues, you're never going to mitigate total harms like saying gambling is 100% safe or 100% gone. And that's something to consider, that, one of the reasons why people have argued legalization of a lot of things is that the power to control is the power to quash. People are arguing that if we legalize things like marijuana nationwide, then at least the government would be able to have their kind of strict regulation on, their strict regulatory thumb on the scale. Finally, on the con, you should not and does not need to question the harms. In fact, if you try to say that there are no harms, you're probably lying. You need to show how state regulations is better, or why federal regulations will offer no advantage. Key things to keep in mind. So with that being said, we have reached the end of the topic discussion for the February 2026 topic in PF. I'm going to turn off the recording and we'll open the floor for any questions. Hey, everybody, it's me again. I just wanted to come back and cover something that I said I was going to cover more in the main video, but it slipped my mind. And then after I turned off the recording, we ended up talking about it, and it became kind of a really cool discussion. So I wanted to put this out there for those that either weren't able to attend the meeting tonight or had to leave early. Earlier in the video, I said I was going to talk about the Chevron deference doctrine, and we never covered it. So what the Chevron deference doctrine was, it was a Supreme Court decision that lasted for almost 40 years, and it was overturned last summer. What the doctrine said is that when there is no congressional action, it is up to the federal agencies to create regulation. So, for instance, the EPA can create fuel gas standards or can create pollution standards. The Energy Department, if the Energy Department does not create regulations on wind turbines, that can be left to an independent government agency. The Federal Reserve can create monetary policy. All of these things were laid out by the Chevron deference doctrine, the idea that you defer to the agencies. This was a Supreme Court decision back many years ago. This was precedent. This was stare decisis up until about last summer. Last summer, the Supreme Court overturned this. They said that Congress has to act to create the standards themselves, or it has to be left to the best interpretations and what is fair within the judicial branch. So the court rulings, what is best, what the courts decide is best. This poses a couple interesting points. One is, would the FTC even be able to regulate this? Would they have the power to? Knowing that we're defaulting to either congressional action or we're defaulting to judicial questioning. Well, Congress doesn't move fast at all. That's why the deference doctrine was put in place. When the court originally decided that decision years ago, they determined that sometimes the courts that Congress can't act fast enough to take the place of a pressing issue that one of the subsidiaries can. So Congress would have to act in order to do this, and we see that they're mulling over 1,000 things right now. When it comes to sports, they're already looking at taking on NIL, which is going to take years to determine, let alone taking on sports betting, which is a highly regulated and lobbied industry. The second issue is whether or not there would even be a stomach for it in the first place. So whether or not Congress would even want to take up the issue. There are lots of things that Congress does not take up that they let their agencies take up, like fuel standards. Finally, this gives them some political cover. It allows Congress to do things without having to go on record saying that they approve of them doing it. Finally, this puts into question a solvency mechanism. Would the FTC even be able to do it in the first place? As Mr. Rankin pointed out in the chat when we talked about one of the pro arguments, one of the things that would happen is whether or not these regulations would even affect Native American casinos or Native American gambling operations on reservation or tribal land. Native American tribes have generally been seen as independent agencies, and the Supreme Court has upheld that. So the question then becomes would they have regulatory power there? Probably not. Would they have regulatory power in the country, or would it be a broad spectrum, or would it be challenged? Would it be struck down by the courts because the Congress did not act in the first place? So there's lots of things to consider when looking at the concept of the Chevron decision and how it interplays with the FTC. One final thing that we also got talking about that I thought was kind of cool is that in some states, you have to scan your ID in order to, when you sign up for platforms. So you have to be able to take out your ID and scan it. Now, yeah, there's ways around it. We know people that will get fake IDs, or we know people that will steal their parents' IDs in order to get on if you're underage. But some states have it. Iowa, in order to sign up for any sort of online gambling app, you need to have an ID. You don't need that in some states. So which it's really interesting when you consider that Roblox, or not Roblox, Roblox would never do anything this to protect kids like this. Minecraft and Discord are both going to start testing ID verification for age. And if you do not meet their age requirements, you do not get access to the chat features within their programs. So one could say that Discord and Minecraft are more progressive in terms of child safety than the online gambling community. So that's just a couple final notes that I wanted to make on this. Well, with that being said, thank you all for attending tonight, or thank you for watching this video. If you can, it would really help kind of our visibility if you could share and subscribe to the channel or this video. I know I sound like I'm a YouTuber now, but you have to say what you need to say in order to promote your channel's visibility, so that we can reach as many people as possible, so that we can give the best debate experience to as many people as possible. So thank you very much, and good luck in your rounds.